ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all welcome you all to Riyadh in the G20 presidency. And I would like to thank the IIF for inviting me today to speak up. Let me first of all express my wholehearted welcome to all of you being here in Riyadh. It is a well-established tradition that the IIF exchange views on the agenda of the G20 in the country holding the G20 presidency. This is the annual practice we see. Allow me to share my views with you here in the capital city, just ahead of the G20 presidency and the meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors. I will first touch on the global developments and the outlook for presenting more in detail the G20 finance track agenda, and then we'll touch briefly about the Saudi economy. First of all, with regard to the global economy, we all know that the global economy has been going through some challenges lately due to either trade tension or geopolitical uncertainties, and some social unrest in some parts of the world, including in this region. If you add to that the structural challenges in many countries, it was therefore not unexpected to see global growth slowing in the last year. As a matter of fact, we experienced the lowest outcome in terms of global GDP growth since the global financial crisis. This backdrop was definitely a challenging one for the policymakers. But the Phase 1 trade agreement between China and the US and more orderly Brexit process helped in stabilizing the business confidence. With inflation very benign, with notwithstanding a further reduction in unemployment rates in many advanced economies, central bankers were able to ease policy in 2019. The ensuing rise in financial assets led to a further accommodation in financial conditions. It also triggered renewed strengthening of capital flows in the direction of emerging markets, which in turn led to more supportive monetary and financial conditions in many of these countries too. But central bankers are no longer the heroes they used to be a decade ago. Questions are being raised about the continued efficacy of a still more expansionary monetary policy stance, given the already very low interest rate levels. In other words, major central banks are left with limited policy headroom to maneuver a more serious economic slowdown. Moreover, the jury is still out on whether elevated financial asset prices are becoming a risk of financial stability. And a debate is ongoing on whether the negative side effects of the negative policy interest rates are starting to show more strongly. Low for long has meanwhile become embedded in the psychology of market investors, but it carries the risk that the unexpected tightening of financial conditions could have serious consequences also for the real economy. The good news, though, is that the financial sector, and notably the banking sector, has continued to strengthen its resilience in both the advanced and emerging markets. The authorities in general, and the G20 in particular, can take credit for this welcome development, which results from the improved financial regulation and the strengthened micro and macro prudential policies. But we know the job is still ongoing, in particular for what concerns the non-bank financial sector. The not so good news is that the prolonged period of accommodative financial conditions has continued, pushing investors to search for yield in riskier and more illiquid assets. Although this may support economic activity, it is also contributing to a build-up of debt and vulnerabilities. I only have to refer to the IIF Global Debt Monitor of last month to illustrate the case. Global debt to GDP ratios resumed its upward trend in 2019 and hit an all-time high in the third quarter of last year, which is the latest data point. Even the financial sector now seems to have halted its deleveraging cycle. With regard to the Saudi economy, as an open economy, Saudi Arabia, just as any other country in the region, is under the influence of these global developments. What I can say in a nutshell is that GDP growth in Saudi Arabia is projected to see an upturn this year. This positive development will owe mostly to a further strengthening of growth in the non-oil sector. Monetary, fiscal, and structural policies in my country are all geared towards an expansion of private non-oil sector over the midterm. Our key policy goal is indeed to promote economic diversification in a context of a stable monetary and financial conditions. This is positive message not only for Saudi citizens, but also for the region. At our upcoming G20 meeting, we will be looking for good news from other countries as well, which overall will hopefully confirm the baseline projection that the growth slowdown has bottomed out, and the turnaround in output growth in the current year can be expected, albeit moderate one. We should not disregard, though, that we are still confronted with a number of downside risks. An escalation of trade tensions cannot be fully discarded, and reform of the WTO is still some way off. Geopolitical risks remain with us, and the risk of a pandemic following the outbreak of the coronavirus in China looms on the horizon. It is still too early to get a full picture of the economic damage from this event to the global growth this year. Against this background, the Saudi G20 presidency intends to put more focus on global risk monitoring, and that can be further enhanced, and how policy cooperation to address those risks can be achieved by the G20. After all, a better understanding of the risk map should allow for a more effective policy response to potential future shocks. This should be of help in establishing the conditions required to deliver strong, sustainable, balanced, and more inclusive growth, which is the primary goal of the G20. Let me now turn to the G20 agenda for this year more specifically. To paint you a broader picture of the Saudi presidency's aspirations for 2020, it is probably best to recall the overall theme of our G20 presidency, which is realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all. Three key aims fall under this theme. First, to empower people by creating conditions under which especially women and youth can live, work, and thrive. Second, to safeguard the planet by fostering collective efforts to protect our global commons. Third, to shape new frontiers by reaping the benefits of innovations and technology advancement. For an effective division of labor, the first and the third aims will be the focus of the finance track, whilst the climate change issues will be tackled by the Sherpa track. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report last month flagged environmental concerns to be the top of the long-term risks. And the financial sector is also paying increasing attention to such concerns. One can refer here to its growing emphasis on sustainable business practices. Also, ESG-themed banking and investment products are becoming more and more relevant. On the side of the public sector, international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank have been increasingly vocal on environmental matters and their link to economic performance. And as central banks, we will need to prepare for a better integration of climate-related risks, both the physical ones and the transition-related ones, in our analysis of factors that can become sources of monetary or financial instability. A big focal point for the Saudi G20 presidency under the finance track will be the implications of the increasing use of technology in various aspects of our economic life. In other words, the growing digitization of our economy. It will cover tax challenges for digitization, benefits of technology for infrastructure, and obviously aspects of the use of technology in the financial sector. Digital innovation in the financial sector indeed holds a lot of potential. The private sector has embraced the new technologies in various ways. New financial business processes have emerged, including new financial products that are transforming the activities of existing banks as well as bringing new players to the field. On a proposal from the Saudi presidency, the G20 will be looking this year at a number of areas where opportunities are cropping up thanks to technology. Let me mention here in particular technology-enabled supervisory and regulatory regulatory solutions and the enhancement of global cross-border payment systems. At the same time, it is the responsibility of the public sector to pay due attention to new risks and the challenges that may be emerging as a result of the growing use of technology in the financial sector. Two of those risks on which the G20 has already started working on will be high on this year's agenda, namely the growing involvement of large technology firms in the provision of financial services and better cyber resilience for our financial infrastructure. All of these technology-related topics are typical ones for which it will be important to have a good dialogue between the private financial sector and the authorities. It is worthwhile underlying also that these are topics that are not just relevant for the G20, but for all countries around the world, including in the MENA region. I am pleased to note that you will be discussing some of these issues later today. Digital innovation not only holds a promise of faster, better, and cheaper financial services, it can also be exploited to advance financial inclusion. That should enhance access to new opportunities for people, and in particular, empower those segments of our young citizens who are currently unbanked. A more inclusive access to finance should also benefit the SMEs, which will be instrumental for achieving the economic diversification we are aiming at. This is the kind of financial widening that can foster growth and make it more inclusive at the same time. Embracing digital and innovation technologies to foster financial inclusion is an area where banks may find themselves in competition with other non-bank actors. But it is also an area which holds the prospect for banks to expand their customer base, and it should enable them to offer an increased number of financial products to this wider set of customers. It goes without saying that this is a topic of high relevance not just for Saudi Arabia, but also for other emerging and developing economies in the world, including in the MENA region, which is why the G20 continues to give full support to keeping financial inclusion high in its agenda. Apart from the financial widening, which is the outcome of more financial inclusion, we also want to put on the focus financial deepening, namely by looking into approaches for developing domestic capital markets. The banking sector should not regard a more sophisticated domestic capital market as a competing substitute for its own business of channeling saving to investment opportunities. On the contrary, a well-functioning capital market, including a corporate leg on the bond side and equity segment, can generate many complementary financial services for banks. At the same time, it offers potential to better hedge some of their risks, free up their balance sheets for more loan origination, and manage their financing more efficiently. Hence, it can offer win-win propositions for everyone, and it can do so for countries facing a saving investment surplus, as well as for those facing an external deficit. The MENA region indeed comprises both of those categories. A final focal point in the financial domain concerns the LIBOR transition. where we expect the G20 to take stock of the progress made by the private sector and any challenges remaining for a smooth transition away from the LIBOR to alternative benchmarks. Let me conclude by saying that as a presidency, we will do our utmost to provide further value added for the G20 in delivering on its ongoing commitment of enabling strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. This is a commitment that should benefit not only the citizens of the G20 countries, but all countries on the regions and the regions of the world. But it is also a commitment for which all authorities need the full support of the private sector, including the financial sector. The IIF is one of the valuable stakeholders in this process. Your presence here today in Riyadh demonstrates your willingness to engage in such an effort. I wish you a successful continuation of your discussion and thank you for your attention.